Thank you, Dr. Wu. Thank you particularly for pointing out the challenges to young democracies. I'm always reminded of the challenges for all democracies, and I believe it was Václav Havel who said that democracy is a line on the horizon, and we're sort of all moving towards a perfect democracy. Again, I would emphasize that the special responsibilities that Taiwan has in this very turbulent world that we are in right now to set a standard and maintain that standard so that people who are struggling for democracy elsewhere in the world can see a role model that they want to be following. In terms of U.S. commitment to Taiwan, there are a number of ways to measure support in Congress. One, of course, is numbers, but another one that I think is really important that's being represented today is who is willing to speak out. So the fact that we have both the chair and the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee coming today to speak on the importance of ensuring free and fair elections is a really strong signal of the continuing support for Taiwan in the U.S. Congress, and I don't see that support will be diminishing. I'm going to next turn to Sarah Cook, who's going to be talking about Taiwan's elections and democratization from a regional perspective. Sarah?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the Fofosi Foundation for organizing this panel and for inviting me to speak here today. Interestingly, from the previous two other panels, it seems like there was a bit of an expectation that I would focus a little bit more on media issues, though in my prepared remarks I haven't, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions people might have. What I thought I would speak about is, and I think a lot of us are aware of it, but just really going back and looking through some of the Freedom House analysis on Taiwan over the last since the 1970s, and talking a little bit about how far Taiwan has come and how it compares to other countries in the region, including China, and then maybe say a few additional words about some of the things that Freedom House is thinking and is looking at as we approach these very important elections in January. Well, Freedom House, as with many other places, Freedom House has been following political rights and civil liberties in Taiwan since the 1970s, when we began our Freedom in the World Index, which assesses political rights and civil liberties in every country in the world. And in fact, Freedom House assesses Taiwan as its own country. When you look at the data, and I actually have a little graph. There's a few handouts in the front. It just wasn't possible to share it today. It's really incredible. You just really see the real miracle of Taiwan's democratization process, going from a place in the 1970s where, on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being the best and 7 being the worst, Taiwan's average score for political rights and civil liberties was a 5.5. And it was in a not free category. And then it kind of goes up through the partly free as you start having the first elections and you have some of the initial institutional changes, of course, the lifting of martial law, all the way up to the early 2000s, where Taiwan, ends up with the ranking. I think for 1 year was even a 1-1. It's slipped that back a bit. It's an average now of 1.5, which puts Taiwan not only among one of the leading democracies in Asia, alongside Japan and South Korea, but really in the top internationally. And on par in terms of Freedom House's rankings, not just being free, but on par with even much more longer-term democracies in Western Europe. And that's something that has meaning both for the Taiwanese people, of course, and what they've been able to achieve, but again, also for the message that this sends internationally, both because of it being Asian culture, a Chinese culture, the strong mentions obviously of Chinese culture and Chinese language, and just a country that was able to make that kind of a dramatic change with bumps in the road, but overall fairly smoothly and peacefully. And so which brings me to my second point with regards to how Taiwan compares to other countries in Asia. As I mentioned, it's alongside Japan and South Korea, ahead of larger, messier, and still less liberal and consolidated democracies like Indonesia and India. And I think one of the measures of that is actually how deep Taiwan's democratization process has gone, where it's gone not only, where the changes have been not only in elections, but also in spheres like the media, the judiciary. I was going back and reading some of the Freedom in the World reports on Taiwan from the early 1990s, and you could go back even further, and then thinking about the situation situation in Taiwan today, and it really is dramatic, whether it's in terms of the reduced control of the government over the media, or the extent of the role that the Council of Grand Justice plays in the judiciary, or just, conditions in prisons and things like that. It's really been a change at a much deeper level in a way that's different from some of the other democracies in Asia, like Indonesia, which really, in terms of access to justice, religious freedom issues, is facing still many significant problems, even though they've had several rounds of good elections. And then, of course, you move down the spectrum. You move down the spectrum to some of the partly free countries, like semi-authoritarian countries like Malaysia, countries like Pakistan, through down to the real not frees, the countries that are scoring, that are still scoring now in the 5s and 6s and 7s on Freedom House's ranking for political rights and civil liberties, and included amongst them is China. And in fact, when we look around the world, about 60% of the world's people who are living in countries that Freedom House designates as not free are in one country, which is China. And China right now scores a 7 on political rights and a 6 on civil liberties. And I think that's it is an important dimension to keep in mind, both when we think about the tendencies of Beijing, its attitude towards issues of democracy and political rights and civil liberties, and the increasing way in which economic incentives and leverage can be used for political means. And I thought, from a comparative perspective, I was again thinking about Taiwan versus China, and I thought I might just give a couple of concrete examples that have struck me in my own observations of the two countries that I think give a bit of a concrete sense of what the real difference is. How stark some of the differences are when it comes to these particular areas. Because in certain other areas, whether it's, language, you have obviously different, you have simplified versus traditional, but there are a lot of other commonalities, which is one of the reasons why, Taiwanese find it so easy to go over and do business in China, and Chinese tourists also enjoy coming over to Taiwan and watching Taiwanese political talk shows. And so that's really one of the differences. So on the political rights side, just if we're talking about elections, I don't know how many of you have been following it, but in China this year, there was a decent number of people who at the very, very, it's like the most pretty low level of people's congresses. And in China right now, the parliament, the National People's Congress, is pretty much still a rubber stamp. It meets for about 2 weeks a year in full. It also has about 3,000 members, so you can imagine, even if they wanted to, how that might operate, even if there was a little bit more room for serious discussion. But basically, at the lowest level, there are these people's congresses that have pretty minimal power, even from that perspective, their oversight of the government. But under Chinese law, there is some potential space for somebody to run as an independent candidate, even though most candidates are vetted by the Chinese Communist Party. So there's been a movement by academics, by lawyers, by some other activists, just to try to be elected as an independent candidate at the low-level People's Congress that barely has any powers. And people have mobilized on microblogs, and it's really been impressive in terms of the creativity and the ways in which these people have tried to get around some of the censorship in China. But the level of intolerance for even that very minimal level dimension of trying to exercise political rights guaranteed under law has been pretty dramatic. I mean, it's not surprising, but you still sometimes hope that the CCP may, concede to some of the demands that are coming from people in Chinese society, whether it's people having their microblogging accounts shut down, and these aren't even on Twitter because Twitter is blocked in China. So this is, these are on the local Sino Weibo microblogging. Some people being detained, people being, of course, visited by various kinds of intelligence and security forces. People, universities being pressured by the administration of the university. People actually getting the number of registered signatures that they need to actually sign up to have their name placed on the ballots, and for various reasons, not getting their name even put on the ballot. And I think that's, by contrast, we see a situation in Taiwan. And again, this is partly just put things in perspective, where although there are some very, there are concerns. There's vote buying is still a problem in Taiwan, as it is in a lot lot of countries. The fact that you have this close of a race in an environment that's as dynamic, and the ability of an opposition party to come back from as a landslide defeat, I guess, in 2008, really says a lot about the strength of Taiwan's democracy and the room for political participation and mobilization for in terms of Taiwanese people's ability to freely choose their government. On the civil liberties side, as I mentioned, the media. Of course, the media in China there's multiple layers of censorship and controls, both on traditional media and increasingly on the internet. Whereas in Taiwan, there are concerns, the hyper-competitiveness of the media environment and the economic dimensions, but still Taiwan and even with the slight declines that we've seen in the last couple of years on Freedom House's ratings, Taiwan is still rated as a free country on freedom of the press. And in fact, from a regional perspective, it's the only one of 2 countries in East Asia that are rated as having a free press. Japan is the other one. South Korea was actually downgraded last year from free to partly free on freedom of the press. And that's one of the reasons why when Chinese tourists, there's lots of anecdotes along these lines, come over to Taiwan, one of the things they appreciate watching on TV are the political talk shows. And whether it's on, whatever station it is and whatever the partisan leaning in some cases, many of the stations are, there's still a vibrancy and a discussion there and an openness that they could not even imagine seeing some of the Chinese Communist Party officials facing up to that kind of level of intense questioning and scrutiny, whether it be from journalists or from other politicians on the opposite side of this political spectrum. And then you have the issues of whether it's freedom of assembly or freedom of religion in China, where you have a situation of not only that Catholic bishops, there are restrictions on Catholic bishops who could be appointed in their affiliation with the Vatican, but on Buddhist temples, on the building of Buddhist temples, on the controls of doctrination, and then groups like Falun Gong practitioners who just the virtue of your faith, you risk being identified as such, you risk being detained, abducted, sent to labor camps, and tortured and possibly killed. By contrast, Taiwan has such a vibrant religious community, so much openness, including a pretty substantial Falun Gong community of tens of thousands of people, even possibly more by some estimates, of people who are able to practice freely without worrying about being abducted or sent to a brainwashing center. And I think, one of the things when we see the interaction and the growing closeness, interaction between these countries, which in a lot of ways has benefited people on both sides, we just need to be careful on the one hand not to jump to conclusions that anyone with any association with China is somehow has anti-democratic motives, behind them. But on the other hand, I think really looking at not being too dismissive of the potential dangers, and the need to really be vigilant, particularly in looking at the economic and monetary dimensions and any use by the Chinese, by Beijing, of monetary incentives to try to constrain or pressure restrictions on democratic rights of people in Taiwan, particularly people like Tibetans or others that the CCP may not like and may be active in Taiwan. So that was one thing I wanted to know. And one thing in the more global perspective is that this isn't entirely unique. We see this situation where you have a large authoritarian country with a powerful economy trying to put pressure and subvert democratic initiatives and forces within neighboring smaller countries happening elsewhere, particularly, for instance, in Russia and its relationship with some of the Baltic countries, even more so in places like Georgia and the Ukraine and the use of some of the energy politics and so on and so forth. So I think this goes into the situation, the relationship between democracy and economics between Taiwan and China is really so important, and I think that's generally true. And with this particular election, it's definitely one of the things that is very important to watch. Which brings me to my last point, and then I'll conclude. And I think it has been mentioned previously, is the issue of transparency. As we look at some of the concerns and the fact that this election is probably going to be as close as it will be, which is a challenge really for any democracy, including, in the United States. There's contentiousness, and whoever is a losing side, if it's a very close vote, wants to be guaranteed that it was a fair loss, too. And the Taiwanese public deserves to know that. And so I think one of the things, whether it's the electoral commissions, it's the two political parties and the way in which they're running their campaigns, it's the media and their role in shining a light, both the mainstream media as well as citizen journalism initiatives, shining a light and really documenting in a credible and a rigorous way any things that they see that may obstruct, but also being fair in a situation where they see that things are going smoothly to not be overly alarmist. It's a real responsibility to be as transparent and as possible in those processes. And I think that's because one of the things in Taiwan is that in addition to how the institutions actually function, which as I mentioned in terms of Freedom House's ratings, overall are functioning pretty well by global standards, is the issue of public trust. And what you see more and more is the weakening of public trust amongst Taiwanese in the core institutions of democracy, whether it's, for instance, like surveys that Louisa had mentioned, or perceptions of judicial corruption. When you actually look at some, academic studies, say of the Council of Grand Justices that I looked at recently, the academics who had looked at this found that there wasn't necessarily a clear bias, which is very refreshing to see and kind of matched with my own impressions. But I think the fact of whether the extent to which the Taiwanese public have trust in the democratic institutions of their country is incredibly important in terms of ensuring a smooth transition if there were a transfer of power or the continuation of the current administration should President Ma be reelected. So I'll stop there. As I mentioned, there are a couple of handouts outside with some of the graphs and a bit more details on this, and I'm happy to answer questions in the media if that's what people really would like to speak about in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Sarah. There are so many interesting topics that are coming up in all of these talks. The issue of public trust, of course, which is something, again, I feel like I'm hammering away on this global responsibility, but public trust is an issue that we're seeing, our lack of public trust challenging governments all around the world. So I think that this is really an opportunity for Taiwan to lead on the global stage. People are hungry for models that work. And also, as I listen to and think about the Taiwan miracle, it's really easy for us all to start seeing the Taiwan miracle as something that exists in and of itself. But I think it's really important to remember that the Taiwan miracle reflects leadership that happened in Taiwan, and it reflects the commitment and desire of the people of Taiwan for freedom and democracy. This miracle didn't just happen. It wasn't what is the cone of silence in Get Smart. It didn't just descend and become a miraculous thing in Taiwan. It is something that comes from the people of Taiwan and the governing people of Taiwan. And it's really important, I think, for all of the party structures and all of the government structures to continue to embrace that and reflect it. I'm also very interested in this, the fact that mainland tourists coming to Taiwan are very intrigued and spending some of their time watching political shows, and would note also that in Hong Kong we've been hearing that when demonstrations happen, like the June 4th demonstration, there are people coming over from Guangdong in order to be able to, they say, observe or to participate. So these are really important models of the possibility of a democratizing China. I have no illusions that that is going to happen or happen quickly, but they're really important models, and as people are being exposed to it in the mainland, that's an important thing for us all to remember. So another issue that has kept coming up, though I'm not sure we knew that was going to happen, was media and press freedoms. So it's perfectly appropriate that we move on to our journalist, although I'm not sure that that's what he's going to talk about. He is going to be talking about ensuring free and fair elections in Taiwan and why Taiwan matters, but I'm sure he would have opinions on media also.
Well, Carolyn, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the Formosa Foundation for inviting me and convening this panel today. You gave me a great topic to talk on, how to ensure free and fair elections in Taiwan, but I think I better think about it because I've actually had prepared remarks on a slightly different topic, but perhaps the next election I can talk about that. What I'd like to talk about today, though, is just what makes Taiwan's democracy special and why it is important to the United States. And to answer that question, I think it's important to keep in mind the high profile that Taiwan's democracy has in East Asia and what sort of distinguishes it from a lot of the other democracies, at least in that part of the world. And some of these observations may be quite obvious, but it seems that we often lose track of them when we start talking about how to deal with the Taiwan issue. So I'd like to highlight why Taiwan's democracy profile is really out of proportion to the size of the country and the population of 23 million people. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is that democracy in Taiwan is the result of the struggle and sacrifice by the Taiwanese people against an autocratic regime over many decades. And of course that regime came from China in the late 1940s, and it has now been greatly transformed itself. But it does seem that this transformation is still a work in progress, as Joe and others have mentioned. Their old habits die hard, and there has been some regression, especially in the last 3 to 3.5 years. But the point is that this is a homegrown, home-brewed, grassroots Taiwan democratic revolution that was aided, of course, by outsiders, including many from the United States. And it's also benefited from the enlightened decisions by the Chinese Nationalist Party that eventually allowed itself to be voted out of power for the first time in the year 2000. But the evolution of Taiwan's democratic institutions and practices was crucially shaped and driven forward by pressures from below, and often in the form of peaceful street protests and underground publishing and industry. So what this means is that because the Taiwanese have won their democracy the hard way, it's not something that can be bargained away by Washington in some nutty strategic calculation, or it's not something that even the elected leaders of Taiwan themselves can give up without the formal and not just the implicit consent of the people. And secondly, as an Asian democracy, Taiwan's political example resonates powerfully across the region. Sarah has mentioned this, and Carolyn and others too. And especially, of course, we're talking about really China. Sometimes you hear Taiwan's democracy called the first Chinese democracy. But not everyone is happy with that label because it obscures the new identity that is emerging on the island. And ironically, this Taiwanese identity has strengthened even under the current government of President Ma Ying-jeou, who considers Taiwan to be part of a Chinese nation. But still, the label tells us something about why democratic Taiwan resonates so powerfully across the Taiwan Strait, and why Beijing works so hard to subvert it and to tamp down the example that Taiwan offers. And I think it's important also, it used to be fashionable to talk about the Taiwan model, but I don't know that anybody thinks Taiwan's model is particularly good for China or suitable for China, but certainly what political scientists sometimes call the demonstration effect is very, very crucial. Indeed, it would be very hard to imagine the great democratization project in China ever getting underway, if it ever does get underway in any serious sense, without the momentum and the social and political and intellectual capital that has been generated by Taiwan's own rich political experience. And another point I think is useful to keep in mind is that Taiwan's democracy is a deeply stabilizing influence for the island and for the region. And I think this is a point that's often overlooked, and especially by those who work on military security issues and worry perhaps excessively about Taiwanese leaders acting foolishly and provoking conflict across the Taiwan Strait. This perception of conflict can be a very difficult issue to manage, as we saw during the last few years of the George W. Bush administration. But the truth is that the Taiwanese have not been inclined to sit idly by while they let themselves be annexed by Chinese autocrats thousands of kilometers away, nor were they inclined to sit idly by and continue under decades of martial law. And so now that we are well into the democratic era and we are looking at the 5th presidential election, which is only 6 weeks away, the hope and confidence of the Taiwanese people in their future clearly rests as much on their constitutional guarantees of democratic rights and free elections as it does on any of their economic successes, which have been very remarkable as well. And of course, this is something that Beijing has been unwilling to acknowledge and has been actively subverting. And it's something I think a lot of us sometimes also forget, that sometimes I think the Taiwanese themselves forget it too, that it's really what gives them confidence about the future and makes them such a vibrant society is not the rise or fall of macroeconomic indicators. It's really this remarkably stable system of government that they have developed in the last 20-some years. And I think the vigorously competitive elections have also been very reassuring to Japan, who likes the idea of having a democratic Taiwan sitting astride the sea lanes of communication that are so crucial to the Japanese economy. And it also is a confirmation, I think, of that the values and institutions that the United States is promoting in Asia are the right ones, because they do produce the domestic stability and the vibrant social and economic development that we want to see in the region. I have a friend who is a scholar on China, and she often says with a twinkle in her eye that the Taiwanese will be electing their leaders long after the Politburo in Beijing has gone into the history books. And this may sound like a leap of faith, especially at a time when it's become fashionable to talk about whether or not to cut Taiwan off from American support. But I think my friend's comment really describes an existing reality that both Beijing and Washington are facing. Leaders in Taiwan will come and go, but elections in Taiwan are here to stay, and most likely with rotation in power among the political parties. So there's a lot riding on the success of Taiwan's democracy. And it was very encouraging to read Secretary of State Clinton's speech a few weeks ago in Honolulu at the East-West Center, in which she famously talked about the pivot. The United States had reached a point of pivoting on Asia after a decade of fighting two wars in the Middle East. And I thought it was especially strong and substantive reset of American Asia policy. And it incidentally presented a very suitable and friendly framework for a more engaged U.S. policy on Taiwan. At one point, Secretary Clinton said, "Openness, freedom, transparency, and fairness have meaning far beyond the business realm. Just as the United States advocates for them in an economic context, we also advocate for them in political and social contexts. We support not only open economies, but open societies." So there's no doubt that as we pivot on Asia, this must include Taiwan, which Secretary Clinton described as an important security and economic partner. And even if she didn't say so, I think it's pretty clear that Taiwan fits very easily on the list of American allies and fellow democracies in East Asia, which, of course, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and Thailand, which are our core alliance partners in the region. And meanwhile, we're seeing other countries and global powers pivoting on Asia as well. There was a commentary yesterday in the Washington Post by a Russian magazine editor talking about the second stint as president of Vladimir Putin, who is looking east, and he's pivoting really towards China as part of his strategy to develop the Russian Far East. And we've also seen China pivoting in some ways on Asia, because they have opened this ambitious free trade zone with Southeast Asian nations, and they have massive infrastructure projects in the region that are often impossible or difficult for these local countries the local governments to resist. But as Secretary Clinton said in her talk, what America brings to the table in Asia is an affirmation of values that goes beyond the business realm. And those values are already shared in abundance in Taiwan. So the elections in January, for all these reasons, should keep Taiwan on a path that makes Washington more comfortable, makes us all more comfortable about the future and not less. And because it is keeping the society on the track of being a stable and progressive example to the rest of Asia, and especially to China. Now, of course, Beijing has a different view of these things, and we need to hear Beijing's views, as we do quite regularly. But I think it's pretty clear the tides of history are flowing against the sort of political model that Beijing is proposing, and in favor of continuing the democratic development, however receding, however it is always in the distance of, as Carolyn said, of trying to perfect that goal. You're never quite arrived yet, but it's something that is Taiwan is very much on the way to doing. So I'm quite hopeful that whoever wins, and as we all know, it's a close race this year, that it will be an affirmation of the new Asia policies that this administration has recently stated, and hopefully will be more than aspirational. Provide some follow-up and resources to make them a reality. And I think Taiwan fits very comfortably into that reality, and I would hope to see that whoever wins, the U.S. relationship will be strengthened as a result of these elections and not weakened. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our panelists. And I think it's always a good discussion when the issues that people thought that they were going to come in and talk about aren't necessarily the issues that we end up talking about, because there's so much ground to cover. A couple of comments on Julian's comments, and then we'll move to questions and answer. We are expecting Congressman Royce and Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton, and so we'll break. Again, I'll ask for people's forbearance. Julian, you mentioned how important Taiwan's democracy is to Japan and elsewhere in the region. Similarly, as we look at why Taiwan matters to the United States, I think we really need to recognize how the U.S. support for Taiwan's democracy matters to Japan and elsewhere in the region. And I think that the Obama administration has really been saying some of the right things lately, as it has been focused more on Asia. I know that people have had a tendency to react or overreact to some of the things that have been showing up on the op-ed pages in our papers, and would just remind people that we have a very robust public conversation, not always well informed, but very robust public conversation going on about a number of topics. And nowadays it seems that people have to say more and more outrageous things in order to be able to get their voice heard at all. So I think it's very important for people to remember to listen to what our U.S. government officials are saying in their recent speeches, and not worry quite as much about what people might be writing in order to get their name out there as a foreign policy expert and get more attention. So with that note, I would really like to turn it over to the audience to see if we have any questions that people have. Betty?
President of the World Journal. Ambassador Wu mentioned about there's a trend or there's a call for teaching Taiwan nowadays in the U.S. So I'd like to know whether the panel can shed the light on where this came from. Does China lobby have anything to do with it? Groups like Sanya Initiative or Bill Owens? And also how people can counter this kind of trend or movement. And also we've seen like Michael Swin talk about the U.S. should negotiate directly with China on arms sales and Chinese military deployment. Also, we've seen Liam Pineda talk about U.S. giving China heads up on F-16 sales. So do we really know what the administration is thinking about? And also, I'd like Hannah to comment on your take on the recent President Obama's trip and Secretary Clinton's situation.
That's a lot of questions there, but that's good. I think it will engender some robust discussion among our panelists. I think some of the heart, Betty, of what you're asking is perhaps who is the administration listening to as it is formulating or carrying on its Taiwan policy. And I'd be interested, although it's a little bit off topic of what we've been talking about, a little interested in if our panelists have anything that they'd like to add to respond to that, and then we can pick up some of the other pieces of your question. Anybody want to take that on? All right, Julian?
I think Dr. Wu would be the best person to take that on.
Dr. Wu?
I will have a few words on Pat's questions. Indeed, we have heard lots of voices in the Washington, D.C. policy circles these days on that topic. They either publish in newspaper op-ed or in international journals, reputable international journals, and they call for abandoning Taiwan or ditching Taiwan for some purposes, for one way or another. And this is new phenomena in the last couple of years. We haven't seen that before this couple of years, and therefore this is a new phenomena that we have to be aware of. If this kind of voice is getting louder and louder, we are very concerned that it might affect the decision-making of the administration. Up until this moment, I haven't detected that the administration is affected by this kind of voice. But look at the fact that some of those people who made similar comments were originally serving in the administration, especially those who served in Pentagon Circle. And it can be alarming to some of us who think that some of those previous officials are actually saying something that they were not saying before. And if this kind of tendency continues to grow, it is something that we need to watch out for. And the current administration, I haven't detected any kind of indication that would indicate that they are thinking along the line of those voices, newly rising voices. And on the side of the Congress, I can still sense very strong support of Taiwan and Taiwan democracy. And perhaps this is something that we can count on. And perhaps this is something that we in Taiwan needs to think very seriously on. Whether this is the government or the opposition, we have to encounter that kind of voices coming from Washington, D.C.'s policy circle to make sure to the American decision makers that Taiwan wants to align with the United States, either an ally that can be trusted on strategic front or in other front, or as an ally of the United States on joint value. And again, I would say that this is a new voices in Washington, D.C. circle. And as Caroline said, perhaps we need to pay more attention to decision makers rather than to those op-ed pieces. But if these kinds of voices continue to grow, this is something that we need to be very careful on.
And a couple of comments on that. Dr. Wu, you mentioned that the government or the opposition in Taiwan needs to be focused on this, and I would say this is a case where the government and the opposition in Taiwan need to be working together in continuing to increase support for Taiwan in the U.S. Congress. The Congress is a very important player in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and I think we saw increased support for Taiwan, increased congressional support on the issue of the F-16s. That was really a mobilizing cause in the Congress, and I think that that's really important. Betty, to another piece of what you asked, while I'm not here in my capacity as a U.S.-China commissioner, I'll just say that we did release our report the week before Thanksgiving, and former Chairman Larry Wurtzel and I filed some additional views that raised some questions about the Sanya Initiative and other activities that are taking place. It is important for everybody to look deeply at the activities of the people, former administration officials, and what they're doing. Many people are now making money doing business deals with China, and so there are incentives for them to say certain things. So I would encourage people to look at that if you haven't already done so. Did anybody else want to answer that question? Sarah, do I see you?
Oh.
No?
Being based in New York, I don't have quite as I think, closer grasp of some of the discussions happening in the halls here in Washington, D.C. as some of the other panelists.
Louisa?
I just want to mention that my favorite title of one of the pieces that's come out recently refuting the abandoned Taiwan voices, Top 10 Unicorns of China Policy. You can find that on the AEI website. Dan Blumenthal hit upon a very nice headset. I think it's in Foreign Affairs, so there's one source.
The Freedom House ourselves on our newly created blog, Freedom at Issue, did actually write a response, including making some of the points I made in my earlier remarks of really the difference between China and Taiwan in terms of Freedom House's own assessments and the symbol and the signal that such an effort to so-called ditch Taiwan would send and reverberate to U.S. democratic allies around the world who are under pressure from large, economically endowed authoritarian regimes.
Yeah. And you can actually see these kinds of statements and pieces as an opportunity in the sense that with so much going on in the world, people aren't always focusing on what's happening in Taiwan or frankly in other places because there are so many emergencies that are happening on a daily basis. And so when somebody says something outrageous, people pivot and it gives people the opportunity, a hook, if you will, to be able to talk about the things and make the what I would say the more rational cases and the cases that are really in the U.S. interest. Anybody else? Julian? No.
I'll pass on that.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Mike, you usually have questions. All right.
Garrett Vanderwees, editor of Taiwan Communique. As a number of you have indicated in your remarks and said in different ways, China is not happy with democracy on its doorstep. And certainly if Taiwan is elected, they will do everything they can to raise tension. How can the U.S., from its position in support of democracy, ensure that things go smoothly in the transition in particular? Can you elaborate on that perhaps?
Anybody? Dr. Wu?
He's asking a question can be properly answered from the Americans.
Julian?
Well, I'll just comment that in the year 2000, when Chen Shui-bian was elected, to everybody's great shock, including, I think, the DPP's shock, the U.S., as I understood, did intervene, at least diplomatically, both with Ray Burkhardt in Taipei and with whoever was the ambassador in Beijing at the time, to reassure and calm down both sides. And it's hard to foresee the circumstances in 6 weeks or probably in May, really, when the president is inaugurated. But there are things that have been done in the past that have been effective. But it really depends on, it largely depends on just how bent out of shape Beijing is about this election. And there's been some talk about discussions or initiatives between the DPP and Beijing in the last 3 years since the DPP has been out of power, and especially since Dr. Tsai has been chairman, which suggests that possibly Beijing is not going to be it will be better prepared this time if the DPP gets back into power than they were in 2000.
Louisa, any comment? Sarah?
I would just make a general point, and that is to thinking about the cost-benefit analysis, and one of the reasons why various diplomatic signals are so important at the outset if there is a transition of power is to show that the United States is paying attention and what it will and will not tolerate. And I think it's when the Beijing feels that no one's paying attention, there aren't going to be any consequences, and if to its to some of its bullying in some cases of not only Taiwan but other situations in terms of trying to restrict freedoms in other countries. And pressure institutions there and governments and non-governmental entities to, take action similar to what Louisa was saying related to even visas and things like that. So I think it's also sending this signal that in and of itself, even though sometimes it can seem like these are just words, it doesn't necessarily always have to be backed up with very clear military or militant kind of language, does send an important signal, and it's very important in realizing how much Beijing does pay attention to what the the U.S. and other countries. I would add the European Union also to the list of entities that should be very ready to congratulate whoever wins. And also, I think, be ready strategically for the United States and for the European Union and the democratic community of countries around the world, not to be caught off guard in the event that Beijing does do something that's more aggressive or extreme, because you have to really have a plan set out, because sometimes what will happen is they'll do something aggressive and we're like caught, and we're like as if we couldn't anticipate that this might happen. So I think I would hope that there are people, whether it's in the State Department or in the European Union and other places among democratic governments, that are at least making some plan, a plan B, in the event so that if there is any kind of pressure or anything, any move that Beijing tries to make, there's an immediate signal sent to respond to that this will not be tolerated or accepted. And I think if that can happen, even just at the diplomatic level, that would be very, very positive and very important to really ensuring stability in the transfer of power in Taiwan and relationships and international affairs in Asia more generally.
Yes. And Beijing obviously would be making a terrible mistake if it thinks that it could do something if it doesn't like the outcome of the election. I think it's important for everybody to remember and keep in perspective that the world will not end on January 15th. I mean, there will, we hope, be a peaceful transfer of power or a continuation of the power that is there. And we don't have any reason to expect otherwise. I do think one of the strongest things that the U.S. government can do is to continue to send clear messages of support for Taiwan's democracy, regardless of the outcome of the presidential election. And with that, actually, I want to introduce Congressman Royce, who is here and has been one of the strongest supporters of Taiwan's democracy in the U.S. Congress. He has been a representative from California since 1993. Did I get that right? Okay, we got it wrong with Mr. Berman. He's a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, an original co-sponsor of the Taiwan Policy Act of 2001. He is an active member, a leading member of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, has long supported a close U.S.-Taiwan partnership, and has long been an advocate for beginning negotiations on a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement. Consistently spoken on the need for the U.S. to honor its commitment to Taiwan through the Taiwan Relations Act, and that Taiwan should be allowed to participate in international organizations. So we're very honored to have Congressman Royce here today to speak on free and fair elections in Taiwan.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Carrie as well, and all the panelists here. And I just will share a few thoughts with you. And one of those is I think I'm pretty pleased, and I bet the panelists are, with a lot of the work done by Chairman Ross Layton and Ranking Member Howard Berman to improve our relations with Taiwan, and part of that has been the Taiwan Policy Act of 2011, which I think is a very important step in the right direction. I serve on the Asia Subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I can tell you I think it's important at this time to stress the political and the economic and the security relationship and the chance at rejuvenation on that front. Carolyn mentioned the Free Trade Act. That is one initiative that I think is very important. But if you look at the way in which the House of Representatives is weighing in here with legislation on the F-16 sales, with legislation to sort of guarantee the freedom of navigation, in the waters around Taiwan, if we think about the work that we're doing, and we hope the Formosan Foundation certainly and many in this room could help on this legislative front. But I think if we can jumpstart the free trade talks, it will be an important message to send. I mean, this is our 9th largest trading partner in the world, and it's an important message to send throughout Asia and the world if we can do this. Let me say this about elections, which is, as Carolyn mentioned, sort of the focus of this panel. Elections, as fiercely competitive as they are really a wonderful thing in democracies. And when you consider that Taiwan has gone from poverty to prosperity in just a generation and a half, that it's gone from autocracy to democracy in such a short period of time, it truly is remarkable. And it is these core democratic values that we see in Taiwan that are the foundation of a strong and prosperous U.S.-Taiwanese relationship. Letting Taiwan's light shine also means letting the Taiwanese people steer their democracy. No one, whether in Washington or in Beijing, should be interfering, period. This election is for the Taiwanese people. Taiwan's democratic transformation, I think, is a legacy that all Taiwanese should be proud of. Taiwanese Americans are very, very proud of that legacy, of that transformation. That fact that Taiwan is much of an example to Asia in terms of the road that can be traveled towards prosperity and towards stability. But like anywhere, it is one that needs constant protection. We have to safeguard our gains in democracy and human rights, taking nothing for granted. And this requires constant vigilance. In any country, democracy or not, there is a tendency to try to stifle debate. There is a tendency to try to shut down political opponents, and this is wrong. Congress has very high standards for Taiwan. If the government strays from its principles, it's our responsibility to help the Taiwanese stand up for free elections and free speech, keeping Taiwan honest to its democratic legacy. Taiwan must continue to be a beacon of democracy, a beacon to Asia, a beacon to the rest of the world, and I have faith in the Taiwanese people that they will determine the best course for their future. Thank you very much.